my name is Elena Piccinelli and I am a PhD student from ISCTE, University Institute of Lisbon, Portugal, and today I'm going to present a scoping review study entitled Foreign-Born Migrants, Perceived Discrimination and Psychological Acculturation as part of the session Acculturation and Migration. So I would like to start by talking about the goals and theoretical framework of the study before moving to the methods, results, and discussion. The main goals of the study were to map and systematize the literature about discrimination towards first-generation immigrants within a psychological acculturation framework, as well as to understand to what extent subtle and blatant discrimination have been considered in the acculturation literature. So when we talk about migrants, we define a very heterogeneous population, which is composed by different groups. And these groups can be characterized based on their type of mobility, which could be permanent or temporary, as well as on the voluntariness of their migration, which could be voluntary or forced. In this context, first-generation immigrants are a specific group of migrants defined as individuals who voluntarily move and permanently settle in a new country, which also differ from other groups of migrants, such as refugees, international students, expatriates, and also from what we call second, third, and further generation immigrants, which refers to people of immigrant descent. So when migrants move to a new country, the contact with a new culture produces a complex process of psychological change that we call psychological acculturation. In this context, the extent to which migrants maintain their own culture and engage in contact with members of their society defines their acculturation strategies, while the outcomes of this process at the psychological level, which refers to mental health and well-being, at the sociocultural level, which refers to cultural learning and behavioral change, and at the cognitive level, which refers to social identification processes, are defined as adaptation outcomes. Also, different groups of migrants may have different motivations and may enter in contact with a new culture for different length of times, and for this reason, they may also undergo through different acculturation processes. Finally, when migrants move to a new country, they may also perceive discrimination. In this context, perceived discrimination can be thought as a continuum that goes from very subtle to very blatant forms of discrimination. Blatant discrimination can be defined as explicit, intentional, and unambiguous unfair treatment that is expressed through the form of overt insults, violent behaviors, and other overt displays of prejudice, which are also usually prohibited by law. On the other side, subtle discrimination is defined as covert, often unintentionally expressed, and ambiguous behavior that can take the form of microaggressions, which are everyday subtle snubs, insults, invalidations, and indignities, which are also very difficult to identify because they're usually expressed through socially normalized behaviors. So what do we know about the effects of discrimination? On one side, a recent meta-analysis that examined these two forms of discrimination in the workplace has found that the effects of subtle discrimination on mental health are at least as harmful as those of blatant discrimination. However, when it comes to the acculturation literature, we know that perceived discrimination in general, that is without distinguishing between subtle and blatant discrimination, affects the psychological acculturation process of different migrant groups. However, the effects of subtle versus blatant discrimination in this context are still unclear. And also, if we look at previous reviews in the field, we see that most of them considered, but did not specifically focus on discrimination, that none of them distinguish between subtle and blatant discrimination, and that most of them focus on specific acculturation constructs, such as psychological or sociocultural adaptation, on specific geographical contexts, such as the US or the European context, and or on specific populations, such as Asian Americans. So in this context, a comprehensive review that addresses the role of discrimination for first-generation immigrants acculturation and that considers acculturation as a broader and more complex framework that is characterized by different models and constructs, as well as distinguishes between subtle and blatant discrimination, is still missing. So to address this gap, we decided to conduct the scoping review, which is a specific type of systematic review that allows to propose a systematized map of the literature or of a certain field. So we wanted to map the theoretical frameworks, concepts, and scales used to study discrimination and psychological acculturation. We wanted to understand how discrimination is associated with acculturation variables, including predictors, mediators, moderators, and outcomes. And also we wanted to understand to what extent subtle and blatant discrimination have been distinguished by researchers. So this is an overview of the procedures that we adopted, we have started by drafting a scoping review protocol, which was published on OSF. In this protocol, we have defined inclusion and exclusion criteria, as well as a search strategy that you can see here. So as you can see, we have searched for words related to discrimination, migration, and acculturation. We have applied this search to 3 databases, EBSCO, Scopus, and Web of Science, from which we retrieved a total of 2,872 unique abstracts. So these abstracts were screened by 2 independent reviewers who agreed to include 350 sources, which were again screened by input text by these 2 independent reviewers, who at the end decided to include 144 records. At this point, we developed and pilot tested a coding scheme, which was applied to all sources for data extraction, and then we conducted data analysis using SPSS, Excel, and NVivo. So this is an overview also of our inclusion criteria. We included peer-reviewed articles using any type of methodologies and published in English after the 1970s, which was the decade of first conceptualization of subtle discrimination as well as microaggressions. And to be included, sources needed to take into account discrimination as part of the psychological acculturation process of first-generation adult immigrants, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, country of origin, country of settlement, and so on. So we did not include underage migrants, people of immigrant descent, as well as other groups of migrants and clinical populations. However, if one source compared 2 or more groups of migrants, such as first and second generation immigrants, then that source was included with the aim of extracting data about our population of interest. And let me show you some results. So this is an overview of the sources characteristics. As you can see, all sources were published between 2000 and 2021, with 60% of them being published between 2011 and 2020. Also, 50% of the studies were conducted in the United States, and 84% in total was conducted in Western countries. When it comes to the methodology, we can see that 90% of the studies adopted a quantitative design, most were cross-sectional. We also had 8 longitudinal design, 1 half longitudinal and 1 half quasi-experimental design. We had 12 qualitative designs, 3 literature reviews, and 1 mixed method study. And when it comes to quantitative studies, an interesting thing is that 60% of them conducted original data collection, while 30% of them used already existing databases. And in this context, the most used database was the one from the National Latino and Asian American Study, which was a survey conducted between 2002 and 2003 in the United States. Here you can see a conceptual map of the concept and scales that we found to be more frequent in our review. So, for example, you can see that discrimination was mostly conceptualized as perceived and experienced discrimination, as well as domain-specific discrimination, which includes racism, religious discrimination, and so on, and everyday discrimination. And the most used scale was the everyday discrimination scale for Williams and colleagues. When it comes to psychological acculturation, you can see that we found that 78% of the sources that we included contained at least 1 concept or variable related to psychological adaptation, mostly depression, psychological distress, and general mental health outcomes. 76% of the sources that we included considered at least 1 concept or variable related to acculturation, mostly acculturative stress, also acculturation attitudes and orientation, and some studies considered socio-demographic variables such as length of residence or nativity status as indicators of acculturation. 45% of the sources that we included considered at least 1 concept or variable related to sociocultural adaptation, mostly linguistic acculturation, also other culture-related concepts such as cultural values, practices, and so on, and general behavioral adaptation. And finally, 23% of the sources that we included considered at least 1 concept or variable related to cognitive adaptation, mostly ethnic and in-group identification, identification with the host society, and bicultural self-efficacy. This is a bubble map that shows the empirical evidence that we found in quantitative studies. So as you can see here, we have found that 86% of the statistical relations that we found considered perceived discrimination as an independent variable. And here you can see the dependent variables grouped by theoretical framework. Then you can see that the bubble size identifies the numbers of studies in which a certain relation was found. Orange bubbles identify positive relations. Blue bubbles identify negative relations, and gray bubbles identify non-significant relations, while the red outline in certain bubbles identifies that the relation was also confirmed by some longitudinal results. So let's look at this together. Here you can see that perceived discrimination was largely studied in relation to mental health and was largely found to be positively related to negative mental health and negatively related to positive mental health. We also have some evidence of a negative relation without group identification and of a positive relation with acculturative stress. When it comes, however, to the other frameworks, such as sociocultural outcomes or acculturation orientations, we see that we have very few studies producing mostly contradictory results. This other map here shows the studies that considered perceived discrimination as a dependent variable. So you can see that we have much less studies, and the few that we found show that there is some evidence for a positive relation between heritage, cultural orientation, and sociocultural adaptation with perceived discrimination, also a negative relation with host culture orientations and perceived discrimination. But and when it comes to other frameworks, we see that we have very few results and also quite contradictory. Finally, I would like to talk about subtle and blatant discrimination. So as you can see, we have found only 23 studies that explicitly considered subtle and or blatant discrimination. Half of them were qualitative, and the quantitative studies that we found were all cross-sectional. So in this context, we have found 7 studies that specifically considered subtle discrimination, and they found it to be negatively related to general mental health, positively related to depression, but they also found, so we had one study that also found a non-significant association between subtle discrimination and depression or self-esteem. And finally, we had 6 studies that compared subtle and blatant discrimination. So they found that both blatant and subtle discrimination positively related to stress and acculturative stress, that subtle but not blatant discrimination was positively related to psychological distress, and that blatant discrimination was negatively related to positive affect, while subtle discrimination was positively related to depressive symptoms. So finally, some take-home messages from this review. First of all, we think that here lies some criticalities of the state of the art, such as the fact that most studies were conducted in Western countries and adopted cross-sectional methodologies, as well as the fact that they recurrently used databases. Also, most of the included studies focused and found a relation between psychological adaptation variables and discrimination. So in this context, we really need to focus on other acculturation constructs, such as cognitive adaptation or acculturation strategies and orientations. And we also have to consider other variables for a sociocultural adaptation, which was mostly operationalized as language proficiency, and this, of course, can be limiting. And finally, when it comes to subtle and blatant discrimination, we can see that we found very few results producing mostly contradictory results about the difference between these 2 forms of discrimination. So we need more, especially longitudinal and quasi-experimental studies to identify the effects of these 2 forms. We also have realized that the conceptualization and operationalization of these 2 forms of discrimination are often very ambiguous and unclear. So for example, if we take the everyday discrimination scale, we can see that sometimes it was used to measure specifically subtle discrimination, while other studies used it to measure both subtle and blatant discrimination. And finally, future research in this context should provide clear definitions and conceptualizations of these 2 forms of discrimination, should try to map existing theoretical frameworks to understand their differences and commonalities, and should also try to understand to what extent existing scales can be used to assess these forms of discrimination. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to use soon your comments, questions, and feedbacks.